Brutus crouched on the edge of a steel I-beam, 70 stories above the city streets that glowed like veins of molten gold in the afternoon light. His talons gripped the narrow flange with unerring precision, each curved claw finding purchase on the riveted surface. Below him, the construction site hummed with activity. Tower cranes swung massive loads of concrete formwork, welders' sparks danced like fireflies in shadowed recesses, and the rhythmic clatter of rebar echoed through the skeletal skeleton of the rising skyscraper. From this lofty vantage, Brutus surveyed the panorama of glass facades and concrete canyons stretching to the horizon, his sharp eyes tracing the distant river as it wound its way toward the harbor. He had claimed this steel spire as his territory weeks earlier, drawn by the promise of high perches and the flocks of city pigeons that clustered on every ledge and parapet. The world below was a labyrinth of impossible geometry, vertical drops, horizontal girders, and precarious scaffolding that shifted and groaned under the weight of machinery and men. Brutus, a juvenile peregrine falcon, had learned to read each movement of the fluttering pigeons, gauging wind currents and updrafts that whispered of unseen thermals. But today, in the glare of the late-day sun, he sensed something amiss, an undercurrent of disturbance that rippled through his domain like a tremor. He extended one wing to test the breeze, feathers catching the light in bands of slate and silver. A sudden noise, abrupt and metallic, rang out behind him, an ungodly screech of steel on steel as a welding torch slipped and gouged a support beam inches from where he perched. Sparks flew, and the beam shuddered, sending a faint vibration through the network of connected girders. Brutus's head snapped around, ruff of feathers bristling, as he watched a cluster of fledgling falcons huddle on a nearby platform. Their nest, an assemblage of sticks and debris scavenged from the site, rested precariously on a horizontal beam, half jutting from the core under construction. The weld slip had weakened the beam's weld point, and a hairline crack meandered along its underside like a jagged scar. Brutus swept down in a single fluid arc, engines of muscle and bone propelling him beneath the sunlit girders. He landed atop the nest, gently brushing aside frightened chicks as he peered over the fissure. The crack widened with a faint creak, and in that instant, Brutus knew that without intervention, the beam would give way under the nest's weight, and under the added burden of an evening thunderstorm promised to roll in. The chicks, too young to fledge, would be cast into the void. He spread his wings to balance, talons wrapped around the beam, and uttered a low, urgent call that echoed down into the wet concrete floors below. The site's crane operators and ground crews paused, eyes turning skyward at the Falcon's unnatural rally. Recognizing the signal, a rare, insistent squawk that peregrines used only in dire circumstance, the lead foreman dropped his wrench and signaled his team with urgent hand gestures. Within moments, an engineer directed a safety harness and line onto the beam. Brutus watched as the workers ascended, careful not to startle him or his brood. He hissed softly to the chicks, coaxing them toward the nest's safer rear edge. The foreman knelt beside the nest, eyes wide as he discovered the crack's severity. The beam's support flange was nearly severed. A technician quickly rigged a hydraulic support jack beneath the beam, while another tied off the nest's perimeter with bungee cords to prevent it from tipping. All the while, Brutus remained atop the nest, his dark eyes never leaving the workers' hands as they clamped a temporary steel plate over the cracked section and tightened it with heavy bolts. When at last the beam sang with renewed integrity, Brutus lifted his head and released a series of clear, triumphant whistles. The chicks chirped in response, and the workers exhaled, brushing dust from their helmets as they stepped back. Far below, the city's constant din resumed in full force. Trucks loaded with steel beams rolled in, and the welders' sparks returned to their shimmer. Yet, on that 50th floor, in the heart of steel and concrete, a fragile falcon's nest had been safeguarded by an unlikely alliance of feather and hand. Brutus spread his wings in a graceful stretch, feathers ruffling in a sudden gust that swept through the building's skeleton. He lifted into the sky, circling once above the nest to reassure the chicks. Then, with a final sharp cry, he soared higher, into the narrowing shafts of light between rising floors, leaving behind the nest, now secure upon its iron perch, and a handful of humans who would never forget the silent watch of their urban sentinel. The morning light slanted in through the steel skeleton of the half-finished tower, illuminating the chaos atop the rooftop like a stage set for disaster. Workers in bright orange vests and yellow hard hats scuttled between piles of rebar and stacks of plywood, shouting instructions into throat mic radios, while others knelt over their safety harnesses, securing lines to the guardrails as a precaution. The wind gusted ominously from the north, sending loose bolts and scraps of metal rattling across the grating. At the center of it all, perched on a narrow I-beam 40 floors above ground, lay the Falcon's nest, and the crisis it had precipitated. Brutus watched from his distant perch, heart pounding as the foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Delgado, approached with a clipboard in one hand and a heavy-duty inspection lamp in the other. He knelt beside the nest, his lamp casting stark shadows across the delicate platform of sticks and debris. Around Delgado's feet, a circle of workers formed, their eyes darting between the Falcon chicks, huddled in terror, and the deep fissure running along the beam's flange. The crack, nearly invisible in the evening's half-light, now gaped like a wound, its jagged edges threatening to split entirely under the slightest additional weight. A safety engineer leaned in, running a gloved hand along the beam, grimacing as he traced the fracture's length. "If this gives way," he muttered, voice low but carrying through the hush, "the nest will go with it, and anyone who tries to hold on." His words hung in the air like an electric charge, drawing a collective breath from the assembled crew. Below them, the city's heartbeat drummed faintly, the distant roar of traffic, the hum of air conditioners, the rumble of a passing train, yet up here the only sound was the tension of steel on the brink. Brutus flexed his wings, his keen mind racing. He had chosen this site for its height, its proximity to the flocks of pigeons that thrived in the city, and the updrafts that lifted him with minimal effort. But he had not foreseen the construction's pace, or the storm that now threatened to tear through the rooftop like a living thing. Dark clouds gathered beyond the girders, promising rain and wind that would test the beam's integrity beyond human calculation. The nest's two chicks peeped weakly, their pale down fluffed in fear. Brutus dipped toward them in a powerful glide, cooing softly, a signal of reassurance he had practiced with them since they hatched. Above him, Delgado snapped open his radio. "All units, secure the perimeter. We need that beam supported before the weather hits." The workers sprang into action. A team unfurled a hydraulic jack from a nearby crate, positioning it under the beam's web, while another anchored a temporary support column of steel tubing nearby. Welders in flame-retardant jackets leaned in, sparking their torches to tack new plates onto the beam's fractured section. Each bright flare against the darkening sky was a temporary prayer against collapse. As molten metal dripped from the welds, Brutus circled above, his dark silhouette cutting across the girders in stoic vigilance. He watched every movement, the engineer's precise measurements, the welder's sparks dancing like fireflies in the half-light, the laborer's gloved hands working with urgent precision. And when the first heavy rain began, cold pellets that pelted his back like needles, he tucked his wings to maintain focus, refusing to be driven away by the storm's tantrum. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a clear ring of sound echoed as the last bolt was tightened and the hydraulic jack's pressure released. The beam sang under the load, no longer quivering or threatening to fail. Delgado sighed, wiping sweat and the rain from his brow. He crouched beside the nest once more, gently nudging the chicks into the newly reinforced center of the platform. As the storm unleashed its first furious gusts, the nest held firm, cradled by steel, both old and newly forged. Brutus landed atop the girders, talons gripping securely as he let out a triumphant cry, a piercing whistle that cut through the rain and thunder shed light on the bond between feather and steel. Below, the crew shook wet hands and exchanged relieved laughter, their faces alight with the knowledge that they had averted catastrophe. The wind howled around them, but atop that rooftop in turmoil, the future of Brutus's fledglings was now secure, a testament to human skill guided by a falcon's unwavering watch. A dull hum of generators and distant clang of heavy machinery echoed through the half-finished floors as Brutus launched himself onto the next level down, wings spread to catch the slight updraft that swirled through the open web of girders. Below him lay a maze of dangling cables, half-assembled conduit, and pools of standing water that gathered around the bases of steel columns. Each of these could spell disaster for the nest should the beam above give way. Brutus hovered in the gloom, eyes sharp as obsidian, noting the flicker of exposed live wires protruding from a junction box and the oily sheen on puddles that marked the drip of hydraulic fluid from the giant crane. He let out a low, urgent coo, a signal that carried through the cavernous space and drew the attention of an electrician still crouched by a console. At his call, a technician looked up, eyes narrowing as he traced Brutus's gaze to the bare copper strands swaying dangerously above a walkway. Muttering a curse, the electrician flipped a switch that de-energized the line, then scrambled to secure it with insulating tape and conduit. Meanwhile, Brutus glided further along the beam, every talon gripping steel, so cold it bit into his pads. He found a stack of loose metal decking sheets, teetering perilously near the work zone. One sudden gust could send them sliding off the edge and endangering everything below, nest and workers alike. With a swift beat of his wings, he nudged the top sheet, letting it clatter to the floor and rolling it against the wall away from the drop-off. As the wind outside picked up, rattling the unfinished facade, Brutus made one last inspection of the beam's underside, claws reaching into the crack's shadow to probe the temporary plate's edges. The welds held firm under his weight, and a satisfied trill escaped him. Below, the crew's voices rose in a chorus of relief as they realized the high-rise's hidden perils had been exposed and addressed, all thanks to this silent sentinel. Brutus then ascended through the steel skeleton one final time, circling above the stabilized beam and its nest, ensuring that every hazard had been neutralized before the approaching storm descended upon the city skyline. As dusk surrendered to the deep hush of midnight, Brutus slipped through the skeletal framework of the tower like a phantom, guided by the faint glow of red beacons marking each floor's elevator shaft. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a promise of rain, and every surface gleamed under the sodium lamps as if oiled for better flow. He landed on a crossbrace 10 stories below the nest, talons locked around the cold steel as he acclimated to the cavernous quietation. Here, the air smelled of curing concrete and fresh paint, mingled with the acrid tang of welding flux that still hung in the rafters. From this vantage, Brutus could peer down the empty floors, seeing the workers' tools scattered like relics, tool belts slung over I-beams, coil hoses coiling silent on gridded floors, and in one corner, a solitary hard hat standing upright as if waiting for its owner's return. His sharp eyes picked out the first hidden peril, a length of nylon safety line, once taut, now frayed and slack, dangling over the edge toward the elevator shaft. A single misstep would send it flailing into the abyss, and any worker relying on it could be plunged through the darkness. Brutus cooed sharply, an urgent summons that echoed down the empty core. Below, the site's night shift foreman, a lean man named Laurent, paused in his clipboard inspection, eyes scanning the girders until they settled on the Falcon. Understanding the signal, Laurent set aside his pen and climbed from a distant stack of plywood to investigate. Within minutes, a crew arrived, eliminating the frayed line and replacing it with a fresh, secure lifeline, clipped firmly to a nearby column. Brutus then scanned the far corner of the floor, where a heap of 35-pound rebar bundles lay precariously close to the edge. Though chained together, they still teetered on the bare steel floor, ready to topple if bumped by heavy equipment or a sudden gust. He launched himself in a silent glide across the floor, landing atop the bundle and using his weight to shift it a few feet back. Below, the second crew member, alerted by the bird's flutter, raced over with mechanical straps, securing the rebar with ratchet binders before it could slide into the void. Continuing his patrol, Brutus moved toward the makeshift rest area, where workers left their coffee cups and sandwich wrappers beside exposed electrical panels. A loose cover rattled in the breeze, revealing live terminals that sparked faintly in the gloom. With a determined flutter, he knocked a nearby traffic cone onto the panel as a temporary warning marker. That cue sent another technician scurrying over, who promptly de-energized the panel, replaced its cover, and tapped in a fresh caution tag for the morning crew. Finally, Brutus ascended another level, back to the floor that cradled his nest, pausing only to confirm that the welded steel plate had held firm since dawn. His frail down chicks stirred at his approach, and their plaintive peeps reminded him of the stakes. Below them, the city's lights shimmered like a field of fireflies. But up here on the midnight heights, Brutus had transformed a construction site's deadly unknowns into a secure refuge for his growing brood. With a final triumphant whistle that resonated through the girders, he settled atop the nested sticks, accepting the protective vigil he had forged over steel and sky. Night brought with it a sudden tempest that rattled the steel skeleton of the tower like a snare drum, and Brutus felt the first fat drops of rain sting his feathers as he hovered above the nest. Far below, a thunderclap echoed through the hollow floors, and lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the web of girders in stark relief. In that flash, he saw the outline of a massive steel plate, one the night crew had just installed, begin to shift, its bolts slick with water and beginning to loosen under the storm's onslaught. Instinct tore through him. If that plate gave way, the nest's platform would tilt catastrophically, sending his chicks tumbling into the void. With a fierce beat of his wings, Brutus dived in a single arrow-straight plunge from his perch at the nest's edge down to the trembling plate. Rain hammered his back as he hurtled through the storm's roar, talons outstretched, eyes blazing with urgency. He struck the plate with enough force to anchor it momentarily, talons gouging into the wet flange as he levered his weight against the metal. Sparks of hydraulic fluid sprayed in the air where the plate's support had been scraped, and only then did the bolt, its head slick with oil and rust, clatter free from the beam, clattering down into the darkness. Below, the night crew, alerted by the resounding crash, raced up the service stairwell two at a time. They found Brutus braced atop the plate, chest heaving and wings drooping under the rain. In the brief lull between thunderclaps, the lead foreman shouted orders. A welder raced forward with a heat lamp to dry the bolt hole, while another gripped a heavy wrench to torque the replacement bolt tight. Brutus watched as sweat and rain mingled on the workers' brows, their hands steady despite the gale funneling through the rafters. Within minutes, the bolt was seated and torqued to specification, the plate secure once more against the storm's fury. Brutus rose then, wings dripping and muscles trembling, to circle above his salvaged nest. His chicks peeped their relief as he alighted gently at their side, ruffling the down at the nape of the older chick's neck. The night's fury faded behind him, but on this storm-lit high-rise, Brutus had proven that a falcon's dive, powered by courage and precision, could turn the tide against even the heaviest dangers. As he settled protectively over his brood, the city lights blinked back into focus through the rain, and the thunderstorm gave way to the soft patter of lingering raindrops, an urban lullaby for a nest safeguarded by steel and feathers alike. When the storm finally spent its wrath, the skies cleared to reveal a pale dawn, washing the city skyline in soft pastel light. Brutus emerged from the nest's protective overhang, shaking drops from his wings like scattered diamonds across the I-beam. Below him, the day shift had arrived. Teams of workers descending the service stairwell in bright safety vests, faces drawn with exhaustion and relief. They carried with them replacement materials, extra steel plates, heavy-duty clamps, and a sturdy crate rigged as a temporary platform. Brutus watched intently as the foreman, Delgado, waved his crew into position, pointing up to the Falcon and then to the nest. A seasoned rigger in a full-body harness clipped himself to the beam's flange and climbed the final few feet to Brutus's level, pausing only long enough to offer the Falcon a respectful nod. Brutus responded with a low, steady coo, a signal of approval, and lifted his wings to clear space. The rigger knelt, gently scooping each chick in turn into the cushioned crate he had brought, bundling them with soft cloth to calm their trembling bodies. Brutus hovered nearby, wings beating in slow salute, as the technician secured the crate's lid and hoisted it carefully with a pulley system to the adjacent girder, away from the storm-weakened platform. Next came the nest itself, a tangle of sticks, debris, and piping scavenged from the site. Delgado directed a flurry of activity as his crew affixed a new, reinforced beam directly beneath the original one. Welders sent sparks dancing, electricians tightened junction boxes, and carpenters assembled a sturdy sub-platform anchored to 4 primary columns. Brutus landed on a nearby beam to oversee the operation, his keen eyes scanning each bolt and weld for potential flaws. When the sub-platform was complete, the crate of chicks was swung gently from its steel jib back toward the newly fortified section, and Brutus gave a single, emphatic whistle of satisfaction. With the chicks safe, the workers turned to disassemble the old nest, salvaging sticks that were as much structural support as they were sentimental token, and reassembled them atop the fresh platform. Brutus offered a soft coo of encouragement as he guided each piece into place, his head tilting to direct hands where they were needed most. When the final twig was nestled and the adult falcon joined his brood under the morning sun, Delgado stepped forward and clapped, his voice ringing with gratitude. "Job well done. Thanks to our feathered foreman." As the crew packed away their tools and the city's hum rose around them, Brutus spread his wings in a majestic arc, the steel beams of the high-rise framing his silhouette against the brightening sky. The nest, once on the brink of collapse, now stood secure on its reinforced perch, a testament to the teamwork between human hands and avian vigilance. Brutus dipped his head to each worker in turn, then launched skyward, carrying with him the promise that on this steel frontier, both Falcon and Foreman had guarded the future together. As the first pale light of morning filtered through the steel framework, the city below began to stir with its usual symphony. Honking horns, rumbling buses, and the distant hum of office air conditioning units awakening for another day. But atop the high-rise, the dawn held a different resonance. Brutus stood astride the newly reinforced nest, his slate-gray wings half folded as he surveyed the broad panorama. The chicks, now nestled beneath his watchful shadow, stirred with soft peeps, ruffling their downy feathers against the early breeze. He dipped his head in a gesture of pride, the gentle coo carrying through the metallic ribs of the unfinished tower and echoing faintly down to the streets below. Down on the construction site, the workers arrived for their shift, blinking against the sunrise, as they had their tired helmets shined by headlamps and received morning briefings. At the base of the tower, Delgado gathered his crew for a moment of collective reflection. He pointed skyward, and as heads tilted up, they saw Brutus perched atop his fortress of steel, a solitary sentinel against the pastel sky. Phones appeared in calloused hands, snapping photos and videos, and soon the story of the falcon who saved the nest spread through WhatsApp groups and social media feeds, inspiring messages of awe and affection across the city. Meanwhile, a small delegation of site safety officers ascended the stairwell to the Falcon's level, carrying a weatherproof plaque they had minted overnight. They affixed it to the nearest column, "In honor of Brutus, guardian of these heights." Brutus watched impassively as they worked, his keen eyes following each hand, each bolt tightened against the steel. When they stepped back and saluted their unlikely hero, he let loose a clear, ringing whistle that seemed to applaud them in return, before folding his wings and turning back to the chicks. Over the following days, the nest became an unexpected landmark. Passing helicopter tours pointed out the little cluster of sticks and steel high above the city's bustle. Architects quoted Brutus in design meetings, advocating for integrated nesting ledges in future towers. Local schools included his story in their environmental curriculum, teaching children how wildlife could adapt and yet remain vulnerable in urban jungles. And every dawn, Brutus maintained his vigil, circling the girders, checking each newly tightened bolt, and guiding curious flocks of pigeons away from the chicks' sheltered roost. When the day came for the chicks to take their first tentative flights, it was Brutus who coaxed them over the edge, wings fluttering against the wind, guiding them toward wider spans of sky. As he soared alongside them, their confidence blossomed with each powerful beat. Below, the city watched in silent wonder as three peregrine silhouettes traced arcs above the concrete canyons. In that moment, Brutus's legacy was assured, not merely as a guardian of steel and feather, but as a symbol of harmony between human ambition and the wild spirit that soars beyond the skyline.